All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Very excited to have Todd McGowan in the house with us. Before I bring him on, I just want to say a few housekeeping items. It's wonderful to be able to host this event. We also at Emancipations do all kinds of activities from in the Lacanian field, studying Marxist texts, studying philosophical texts, hosting a number of debates, sort of a wide range of activities. I want to point out just a couple upcoming things to flag for you. The first is a study group on Lacan's seminar on identification, which we're hosting on Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern for about an hour and a half. This is a line-by-line study session of the seminar on identification. We're reading it in English. We have people of varying levels of familiarity with Lacan. We have people that are analysts, philosophers, everything in between. So it's very sort of an egalitarian learning community that we have here. Want to invite everybody to join this if they're interested. We have a wonderful cartel study group. So check that out. Now, the way that you can do that is by joining our Patreon here. Starting at $3 a month to $5 a month, very modest. But if you can't afford that, that's not the end of the world. We'll still let you come in and study Lacan with us. So don't worry about the money. Welcome to comrades joining in the chat. I usually host these events, these symposiums. We just did one on Joan Kopchak's new book. Now we're doing one on Todd McGowan's new book. I usually host them on Zoom. There was a lot of interest for this particular event, so we decided to host it on YouTube. I recognize that not everybody likes to ask their questions in YouTube chat, but I think it's not that bad. You can use an anonymous avatar. No one will know it's you. So we are going to take your questions from the YouTube chat. It's a comradely chat. People are well behaved in the chat. So don't worry about trolls, because I have the power to delete trolls, and I often do. But lately, it's actually been very clean and very good fun. So that's the basic background on Emancipations. All sorts of cool podcasts coming up. We're probably going to be organizing a series on workers' inquiry with Julie Stout, where we're going to be interviewing a lot of different Marxist theorists that are doing workers' inquiry, as well as sort of worker scholars, worker intellectuals for something. So stay tuned for that. It's very much in the works right now, but it's something that's on the horizon. So I now want to introduce Todd McGowan for his first appearance on Emancipations. Todd, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. Appreciate it.
So good to have you. Welcome again to everyone watching from Twitter or from X and from YouTube. Todd, we want to start almost with just sort of learning about where this book came from. This is probably your 10th or 12th or 15th or 20th book. You're extremely productive. And at a certain level, you forget the number of books that you publish.
Yeah, I don't know the number, but
I know it's a little narcissistic to say, oh, he's the author of 50 books.
Yeah.
We don't need to do that. But I suppose what really is interesting, though, is that for most philosophers, it's usually just a handful of books that become their most important ones. And this one is a very, very likely candidate to enter into that category. And I say that for a particular reason. Yeah. In the English language, Lacan is extraordinarily popular in academia, in philosophy, in comparative literature. I was recently with Derek Hook at his conference up in Duquesne, and somebody presented a number of the total number of Lacanian clinicians in America, and I was astonished at how low it was. And then I thought, well, the number of people that read Lacan as a philosopher, right, as a theorist, as a cultural theorist, is obviously much greater. And one of the things I very much admire about your work, Todd, is that you are not afraid to say, yeah, Lacan is making a serious contribution to philosophy. Like, get over it, right? Now, that's not to say that, because, I'm hinting at this tension, right, between the clinical and the theoretical, right? So maybe that's like a first question, right, which is, how do you respond to that pressure, if that's the right word, that a lot of Lacanians will exert, where they say, well, keep in mind that the audience of Lacan in his seminars were not philosophers, although some were there. They were clinicians, and that Lacan's concepts were meant to be very specific to clinical concerns and the couch and the talking cure and the Freudian tradition. And he's trying to make concrete interventions here. In your work, you are saying that he is one of the most important psychoanalytic philosophers. I think you used that phrase, which is a very different presentation than Alain Badiou, who, as you know, calls Lacan one of the great anti-philosophers. Right? He's actually a great enemy of the Hegelian tradition. Whereas in your position, Lacan is at his best when he is most Hegelian, in fact. And you point out that there is a very particular period of time really kicking off in the seminar on identification, maybe before that too, early 1960s, where Lacan falls into a break from his Kantian philosophical foundation. So I love that. Because for me, it makes me, the work that I do on Lacan, kind of gives it sanction a little bit. So anyways, what do you say to the folks in the Lacanian community that might push back on the centrality of the philosophical that you're advocating for?
Well, I hear that point. I have a lot of friends that are analysts, among them Stephanie. And yeah, I think that's obviously Lacan is incredibly valuable as a analytic thinker. And I underwent, just for a brief time, a little analysis of the Lacanian guy, and that was great for me. So I don't have it's not like I have an issue with that. But about the question of, these things are specific for the clinic. But then I guess my question for always in response is, well, then why all the references to Hegel, to Descartes, so I've heard someone once said to me, well, you can't take these ideas and bring them out of the clinic. And I just thought, well, doesn't that work both ways? Then you can't take the ideas of philosophy and import them into the clinic if you're going to play that game. So I just think that's a game that you could play it both ways. And so I don't see any, I don't know, I guess I don't see any value in that. And in that kind of quibble, again, I think Lacan's very valuable for the clinic. I just don't have anything to say about that. So that's when my response to people that say, why didn't you write a book about I couldn't write that book. So that is, and a lot, I have friends that have written good books, I think, on the clinical Lacan, and I don't think we need another one. So at least not for me. So my interest in Lacan was theoretical. My approach is theoretical, and I feel like he is intervening in a certain, well, for one thing, I think the link to Sartre is really important, and I probably even don't play that up enough in this book. But I think he's really intervening in some of the questions that were important to German idealism, from Kant to Fichte to Schelling to Hegel. So that's, I hear that point. I just don't think, I think there's also this other contribution that is really, and it's just, to me, it's evinced by the number of times he's making references to philosophic figures. Okay, there's a few references to Klein, to Winnicott, but they are far outstripped by the number of references to Hegel, which are always covert references to Kojève, I think, or at least they're through Kojève. So that's what I would say. Like, he's himself showing where his debt lies and where he is positioned, even though, he's making a clinical point a lot of times, but he's also showing this other interest or weight of his thought.
No, 100%. I mean, I had the theologian Peter Rollins on the show, and he said he contends that Lacan's contributions ought to encourage theologians to completely revolutionize what their practice is. And frankly, I think the early Badiou, say in Theory of the Subject, is saying the same thing about Lacan for Marxism.
Yeah.
So
I
there's
think that's right. I think that's why that's Badiou's best book. But yeah,
so we agree on that.
yeah. I also like that this is a kind of little jibe at Jacques Lacan that you're doing a thing on seminar 9, because for some reason that's the one seminar of the first 20 now that's not out. So I think seminar 13 is coming out right now. So it's the one that's not out. So it's I think that one needs to come out. I think it's incredible. As you said, I think it's incredibly important. And that would be great to have an edition of that.
So I want to bring Stephanie Swales on in a moment, Todd, but let me ask one more question. I was inspired by this book because it's unlike a lot of Lacanian books in the sort of the way that you write lucidly and precisely, but also in a way that is kind of clearly confident about a couple of things that struck me. One is this claim, which I guess is not necessarily too debatable in the Lacanian community, of the 3 periods. But what is perhaps debatable is the claim that the 3rd period of Lacan, right, largely falls off, in your view, as it pertains to the overall utility of Lacan for philosophy, for social critique, for theoretical investigation. So I want to ask you sort of, can you kind of explain why the later Lacan doesn't work out too well for you? And when have you always felt this way, or is this a new sort of epiphany or revelation that you've had in more recent years?
Yeah, it's a good question, Daniel. So I didn't write this book because I wanted to write this book. I wrote this book because my friend Maury Rudy, I could never say no to her. She wanted me to co-write it with her. And then before she finished any part of it, she died. And I had finished my half, and the editor at Cambridge said, "Would you finish it?" And I said, "Okay." So I didn't necessarily want to write it. And I think, to answer your question, yeah, for one thing, a number of people that I really, really respect think that the later, especially the formulas of sexuation, have an incredible political bearing on things. So, for instance, Jean Copjec, Guy Le Goffet, just really, really central for them. But I think, when did I so I was talking to Guy one time, and he said to me, he's a French Lacanian psychoanalyst. He said to me, the one problem with the formulas of sexuation is that jouissance becomes divided in this way. And then the other thing he said was that Lacan no longer believes, and this is true, in a signifying chain in the later period, right? So, and it's when he said, this is how Guy puts it, that prior to basically late in seminar 16 or maybe seminar 17, when he turns to the 4 discourses, and he starts to say there is no sexual relationship. He thinks of the signifying chain as a series of Olympic rings. And then he comes up with this idea of the Borromean knot, and then the knot plays such a central role later. And then, and that struck me as really important, that if there's no signifying chain, then the non-relation trumps dialectical relations. And I thought, then that means that's a movement away from what I always took as a fundamentally Hegelian bearing of Lacan's thought, at least in that period. I always thought it extended to the end. And then I talking with him and thinking about that after talking with him, really, that was a thing that caused me to think differently. And I think he would be sad to know that, because I think he still is invested in the later period. I'm not invested in it. I just think that something is really lost in that move. And I can even see, I know that the feminine sexuation has played a really important role in a lot of people's political theorizing. And I don't necessarily want to contest that, but I just feel like there's something lost when you give up the idea of the signifying chain as a kind of way to theorize things.
It's very interesting because in a way, the Mullerian school has put a huge premium of their social analysis and political interventions, as well, of course, as their clinical, on the later Lacan.
Right.
The Lacan of the Santome, the Lacan of the non-relation, and I mean, I'm thinking here of Zizek's Less Than Nothing. At the concluding was my favorite chapter, where he develops this debate with Miller over these precise debates regarding nominalism and realism, and the kind of ultimately the kind of inadequacy of Miller's liberalism.
Right.
Now, you interviewed Jean-Claude Milner on your YouTube channel, and Milner, you may know this, has an incredible essay about Lacan's later work and the political undertones of that later work as an abandonment of the radicalism of his middle period, right? And I was very moved by that, and I was kind of convinced by that. And for those reasons, Marxist reasons, let's say, socialistic reasons, and you could also say reasons having to do with your general point that there is more of a dialectical conception in the middle Lacan, I was less sure. But then I read folks like Thomas Savolos, Psychoanalysis in the 21st Century, and he's deeply indebted to the later formulas and the later conceptions. And what he says about addiction, right? For example, and what he's talking about, like ordinary psychoses. So you see, some of that stuff does need to be incorporated, I think, at least as in the level of analyzing the super egoic demand to enjoy and these symptoms of late capitalism, which only the later Lacan may be open to us. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. There, maybe you could say the methodology moves away from dialectics with the Borromean knot, which, of course, the Borromean stuff Lacan never finishes, and he loses his mind without having developed a proper solution to it.
Well, that there's an interesting. People should. You can find it on YouTube. Guy gives it. It's in French, but Guy gives a discussion of the exact moment when he has this. It's in the Topology and Time seminar 26. He has it in January. He has this moment where he's like, I err. It's because this guy Pierre Curie shows that there are two forms of the Borromean knot, and then that leads Lacan into this kind of a breakdown in front of. He's like, I how could I have made such a stupid error? And it's a really fascinating moment. And I think you're right. He never finishes it. He kind of comes to a roadblock, a point that he can't solve.
Yeah. And some would argue that the same happens in the theory of the four discourses. Our comrade Gabriel Tupanamba argues this. Badiou kind of argues this as well, although I don't agree. I think Lacan's precision of the discourse theory is magisterial, personally. But let me bring on Stephanie. Welcome, Stephanie. Stephanie was recently with us for a remarkable conversation on perversion. Welcome back, Stephanie. It's a little bit later for you. I want to just invite you to pose a few questions to Todd. Maybe share some immediate reflections on how you liked the book, what stood out for you. However you wish. Welcome.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. And it's good to see you, Todd.
Yeah, good to see you.
Well, just to piggyback on your conversation there about the middle versus the late Lacan, I think you're absolutely right to say that there's no such thing as being a Lacanian. that, inevitably one has to choose the early or the middle or the late to, base oneself. But that it's interesting in terms of clinical work. I'll be the token, clinician here. It is interesting that even I can't speak for the Malarians, but there's this idea, right, that basically amongst the practicing Lacanian psychoanalysts, you've got clinicians who are mostly in the middle period, because of course there's a conceptualization of the real and the object A, and certainly valuing the early period with the focus on decentering the imaginary and thinking about it as deception, etc. And then, on the other hand, you have the folks who are interested in developing the clinic of the symptom, of the Bromian knots, this idea that like everyone is mad. But in at least in my experience, people tend to kind of dip into both. That I've met very few folks even who really would kind of place themselves in the clinic of the Bromian knot, who don't also value structural diagnostics and some of the earlier stuff. So I suppose epistemologically it's a little funny, and I sort of wonder what you think about that. And then a kind of sub or related question there is, well, caveat, you can't please everyone with an introduction to the con. And yours was amazing. It's so readable. It's so refreshing. I always love your style of bringing in, real world and film examples, things from politics. So I loved it. Thinking about Lacan as, philosopher of subjectivity who introduces the unconscious. All of this is great. One of the things that you didn't focus on, however, was structural diagnostics very much. And I'm just curious about that as well. Do you think that there's a, are there any kind of interesting philosophical or political possibilities for thinking about structural diagnosis, or not so much?
No, I think I'll just start with that because it's such a great point. Thanks for even staying up for this. It's great to see you. Yeah, I think that I guess so. There was a word limit, and that part of this was controlling certain things. But I think that if I had to do it again, I think I would emphasize a little bit more, because I did go so heavily into the notion of the philosopher of subjectivity, that I think I short shrifted the real importance of Levi-Strauss and structuralism for Lacan, and just what his contribution to that is, because I think it's pretty amazing, really. And I think I could have actually tied it to the part of to thinking about him as a subject, because I think in this really long and famous debate between Levi-Strauss and Sartre in France in the middle of the century, Lacan interestingly fits on both sides, right? Like he's clearly indebted to Levi-Strauss, and he's almost unthinkable without him. And then on the other hand, he always defends the notion of subjectivity that Levi-Strauss would just has nothing to do with. So I do feel like that his contribution to just what you're calling structural diagnostics or to structuralism is really, really important. And I think that's just a casualty of my approach, which I feel bad about, but I can't, something had to not be included. And because, so that even the form of what Daniel called this encyclopedic form, that was dictated by Cambridge. So I wouldn't have put the different concepts, like I just wouldn't write a book like that necessarily. But so that, and I think that it's part of my own interest, maybe, is more on the side of subjectivity than on the side of structure. So that's probably why that fell to the side. About your other point, I don't have a problem with that at all. And I think you're right to say And I mean, I do say this, you sort of have to choose which Lacan you are. But someone said to me, I was talking to them yesterday or the day before, and they said, you're saying you have to either be a early, a middle, or you can't just pick and choose. And actually, I'm kind of saying the opposite. I'm kind of saying, well, no, you can, if you have a certain because Lacan kind of picks it, right? He evolves so much that if you're if you're an analyst, you can, I can't tell you what to do at all. But if you're a theorist, I think you can say, oh, look, because this is true of someone like Rick Boothby, or even Mari, someone for whom Das Ding is really important and the Santome is really important. And so she would just say, I don't care that that's inconsistent and from two different periods of history. I just don't care because those concepts are valuable to me. And so that's what I guess I think that's true probably even more for a clinician. You just are picking what's valuable for you that you think works. And if it doesn't fit within it, then whatever. But I think basically you have one part of Lacan that you're more drawn to than another. I think that's usually true, but I don't think it's even necessarily true. I think it could be like someone like Mari again, who just has these investment in this pretty early period, and also this investment in late period, but has the formulas of sexuation for her were just a dead letter. So that's really interesting to me that someone can find the Santome really important, but can see just nothing of value in the formulas. So that's what I would say to that. So I think, I basically agree with both of your points, your critical points.
I suppose we all find our ways to singularly be Lacanian and express our subjectivity there. Well, so I suppose, another question of mine, just to kind of preface it with, I do think you admirably handled the structure of, now we've got the content, now we have the different terms and things like that, because you give so much helpful context. And I feel like this is really missing in terms of its, the grounding, for instance, as you see it in Hegel and Kant, the conversations with, with other more contemporary philosophers, John Kopchak, et cetera, the way in which, anyway, that she took up Lacan's work. So it really does bring, kind of some of the main tenets of Lacanian analysis to life, I think, in a really helpful way. And I suppose for me, one thing I'm not so sure on is your stance on the distinctions between thinking of our subjective freedom as having to do with the unconscious or having to do with the drive or the death drive. So I'm thinking, for me, I like the distinction that Colette-Solaire makes between the subject of jouissance and the subject of the unconscious. Sort of think of those as two different aspects of subjectivity. So I just wonder if you could speak to that. Where do you locate, or how do you locate differently, or do you see them the same in terms of emancipatory possibilities for the subject?
I know Colette-Solaire thinks that. I've begun to think more and more, about unconscious and death drive is really, really almost the same thing, that the logic of death drive is also the logic of the unconscious. And I know that's not I don't think I think Colette-Solaire is more doctrinarily Lacanian on this point than I am. So I'm probably, I don't even remember that in the book, but that's just probably my idea coming through and not Lacan's, because I think that, but for me, as I've begun to think more and more about death drive for a book that I've been working on, I've started to think more and more like that's really the logic of the unconscious. And so and I think that probably came through in this book, and that probably was an error, because I think you're right that wouldn't be Lacan's position. So that's yeah, I don't have any, I don't have a rebuttal, because I think you're probably right about that.
Okay, well, fair enough. But I look forward to reading your book and hearing more about your argument there. And I guess I just have one more quick question, which would be about, well, it's probably not a quick question. Sorry.
That's okay.
I suppose it's a tough one, but one thing that I always come back to is the challenge of thinking from a political standpoint about the transformative possibilities for the subject and for the in terms of having dialecticized one's desire, or whatever sort of formulation we want to give that relates to Lacan's ideas of the end of analysis, traversing the fundamental fantasy, etc. On the one hand, there's the status that comes across as you argue it, of just having unconscious processes is the site of our subjective freedom. So I wonder about that sort of something more or something else, and then what you see as the most powerful pieces of Lacan to deploy that maybe in a political sense outside of what can happen in psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I mean, you hit on, for me, what is the crucial issue and the crucial question. And I think it's a really hard thing. I mean, you and I have probably talked about this before, even that like that translation of psychoanalytic thinking into politics. I think it's really good for showing political, like how fantasy works politically, or showing, like, undermining political errors, right? But in terms of collectivizing people to act politically, I don't know. I mean, I think that people ask me this question all the time, and I don't have a good answer for it. But because I think it is. I guess I would say I think people are looking all the time. I think I talk about this in the book. I can't remember, but I think people are all looking all the time for a master signifier that they can follow, right? That they can invest themselves in. And I think, to me, that's partly part of what's at work in some of the horrible political catastrophes that have happened in modernity. And so I think that's maybe, to me, one of the most important contributions that Lacan can make, is that the point is not, say, coming up with a new master signifier. It's changing our relationship to the master signifier as such. And I think that it seems to me like that can be somewhat collective as a process, like that sense of whatever the position of the master is, to recognize to have its castration as central to what we're doing. I think because I think there's you can see so many times political movements go awry because they're trying to ensure that the non-castration, or the substantiality, to put in Hegelian terms, of the someone in the leadership or the leader. So I feel like that is the nature of an egalitarian politics, is to have that recognition. So I don't know if that's I mean, that's the best I can do on that. I don't really. I think
that's
it's a hard.
Excellent answer. Yeah, it's a hard question.
It's just a really hard question, and people, everyone always asks me that, but I don't.
Sorry.
Yeah. No. I'm glad. I think it's a great question. It's the question. So I don't think it's not surprising that people ask that all the time, I think. So yeah, I think but that's what I would say, that I think that's really important. And I think it's really tempting. I even have friends, or former friends, that have thought, well, Lacan's point is you got to come up with a new proper master signifier, that's the point of analysis. And and that's how we should translate to politics. And I just think that is not correct. I just don't think that's right at all. So, this person became an anti-vaxxer too. So maybe it's not surprising. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thanks, Todd.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. That's excellent. We will let you go to bed now if you so wish and desire to, but you must come back to talk about all of your interesting work, and you are an extremely productive writer. So I really want to talk to you further. I really enjoyed our last conversation so much. Thank you so much.
That's news to me that I'm an extremely productive writer, but thank you, and I do appreciate
my opinion. Just merely my opinion. So
great conversation.
I'll see you in a week, Stephanie. Yeah.
Take care, Stephanie.
See you.
Todd, so one of the great things about Lacan for people that are watching this and they're like, well, where do I start? You probably get that a lot. In fact, you made a video about that recently, which I liked. One interesting outcome, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, of your new book here that we're talking about is that maybe people should be reading more Kant than Hegel if they want to understand Lacan.
I think that's true.
Right?
I think that's really true, Daniel. And I think it's largely due to the influence of Slavoj that they don't do that they think the real connection is Hegel and Lacan, and that and Slavoj, that, I mean, clearly that's what's important to him. But yeah, I think something came, and you asked me before when certain things came to me, and this is something that really came to me while I was working on this book, that it's not Hegel, it's really Kant. And of course Hegel gets mentioned more by Lacan himself, but it's really Kant that is the foundational figure, because what he's doing, especially early on, is basically laying out a transcendental analytic, right? And you could even say that, I mean, just as Joan Kopchak's point about Seminar 20, that in Seminar 20, he's laying out a transcendental dialectic, right? So you could take, the transcendental aesthetic, the transcendental analytic are the first seminars, and then he waits for a little bit, has a little intermittent period, and then in the end, he comes back and writes his transcendental dialectic. So I think that I agree. I think if you, the text to understand Lacan is the Critique of Pure Reason, and then also the second critique, because I think Seminar 7 is really indebted to what Kant does, both in the groundwork and in the second critique. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. My students wouldn't like that point, because whenever they come to me, they always want to read Hegel. They never say, can we read? I once said to a class of 100 students, I said, look, sometime in your life, it's one of the greatest things any human's ever done. You should read the Critique of Pure Reason. Mm-hmm. You should just take out a month and just read it. And but I think for people coming to Lacan, I think it's not a bad starting point, really.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting, because in the milieu of Lacan's time, Kant is not debated exactly like this, right?
Right. But Daniel, I think
Hegel is. Right?
Hegel is, but not Hegel like we know Hegel, right? I think that is true. So important that the shadow of Kojève is so immense in France that it completely shapes the way that Hegel is understood by everyone. There are zero exceptions in France. Even around the world. So that, to me, really, but you're right. Kant wasn't a presence, but Levi-Strauss was. And I think
Kant is elusive, right? Like I do work on Nietzsche. Now, biographically, I don't know if you knew this, but Nietzsche never finished the full Critique of Pure Reason by Kant. He never finished it.
I did not know that.
No, he never finished it. So, but that's Kant, though, because you see, neo-Kantianism can produce philosophers that don't fully know Kant. That's common, I would argue.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
But that's only perhaps a testament to the profound shadow that he casts on modern philosophy.
For sure.
You don't need to know all of it. In fact, Nietzsche just read secondary literature on Kant. And I think that the dryness of the critique is the reason why people don't organize study groups to look at it when they should. I mean, it's a lot more exciting to read Deleuze's book on Kant than to read Kant.
Right.
That's just a fact.
Yeah.
And so anyways, and that's very interesting, especially how you apply the categories of Kant to the RSI.
I think that seems to me that I almost think, I think I was going to say he had to have that in mind, but I think the thing that he really has in mind is Kierkegaard and the religious, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious, right? But I think somewhere in the background is the Kantian distinction.
Sure. No, I love it. And I mean, there's been a lot of people that say, when it comes to Marxist philosophy, they say, well, Kant is bourgeois idealism, it's subjective idealism. Marx not only does Marx overcome Hegel, but Marx fully overcomes Kant. And that's true, but that's also not true. And there is a tradition of Kantian, let's say, Marxism,
right,
from Lucien Goldman to even Koji Karatani. I mean, what Karatani does as a Marxist to Kant in Transcritique is remarkable.
Right.
So, maybe that might be a way to look at Lacan, to actually, to look at Lacan as sort of seeing Lacan as it's necessary for you to master Kant before you've mastered Lacan. You have to also do the phenomenology of spirit, right? You have to do your Hegel, but what's missing has been Kant. We're now doing very well on time. I want to invite our next speaker, Paris, to join us if he's ready. Hi, Paris.
Yeah. In fact, I'll add to the list. I think that above Hegel and Kant, maybe we should take Lacan's own tip that the biggest barrier to understanding Lacan is mathematical incomprehension. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. All right.
Hi, Paris. Should I introduce you very quickly to our audience?
I'll just tell what I tell people that I'm hitting on. I work on a PhD with Slavoj, etc. Okay, should we go? Because I have a lot to say.
Sure, yeah. Paris is a Lacanian philosopher. He's been on our show before to help us unravel the theory of the discourses, and he's here to be a discussant. We're very much looking forward to a wonderful comradely engagement. Take it away.
Okay, sorry. It's just that I don't have a lot of time because I'm at a wedding and I have to take a ride back to the city at a certain point. So I'm gonna keep it right on the clock. First of all, I'll begin by enumerating some points on which I agree with the book, providing some textual backup. First, that Lacan's work is systematic. As late as 1975, he refers to, quote, my whole system, unquote. Secondly, Lacan's work is philosophical. As late as 1977, he remarks that, quote, what I am doing here is philosophy, unquote. Finally, the systematic and philosophical Lacan is reconstructed first and foremost through his seminar, and only then through his writings, etc. Though he never expressly said so, such is inferred from the claim, for example, that each of his writings, quote, is only the memorial of a refusal of his discourse, i.e. his seminar. Nonetheless, on almost every other point, I reject the premises, claims, and inferences of the book. Such is not my opinion, for I believe that at least one point per concept is refutable on purely textual grounds. For a bona fide scholar, such is thus tantamount to the fact of the matter, full stop. Unfortunately, I only properly have the time to address the main error of the book, which is also not at all coincidentally its main thesis. It goes like this. There are three periods in Lacan's teaching, 50s, 60s, and 70s. The first and last periods are Kantian, and the middle Hegelian on account of their alleged respective positions on the real and knowledge. The middle is the most radical to the extent that there is a knowledge of the real, namely as impossibility or contradiction, which is not there in the early and late periods. For ease, I will consistently denominate this radical period simply as the heyday. Under a certain angle, the thesis could be taken as merely a provocation. Does he not begin the heyday not only by finally forthrightly turning on Hegel in the first lesson of Seminar 9 through the vehicle of the unary trait, and then indeed by likewise patently turning to Kant in the seminar's proposal of a, quote, revised transcendental aesthetics, unquote, by way of topology? And conversely, does he not end the heyday by means of a return to Hegel in Seminar 17 through the four discourses, while nonetheless maintaining his insistence on Kant and topology in the other texts from the 1970s? I won't attack this claim from this angle. Let's sideline the fact that ignoring these express references in Lacan to Kant and Hegel is tantamount to assuming that he doesn't know what he's talking about philosophically. Indeed, in order to be charitable, let's assume that the purpose of the claim's implicit nonchalance is some kind of interpretive clarity that Lacan did not manage to achieve all by himself. Nonetheless, I believe the text speaks for itself. Let's be more specific about the book's thesis, which is subdivisible in 3 points. 1. The symbolic is defined as contradictory. 2. The real is defined as the contradiction or contradictions in the symbolic. 3. These definitions are found most strongly in the heyday. With a relatively small allotment of textual source material, only through Lacan's references to contradiction, I believe that all 3 of these claims can be falsified. Before beginning my exegesis, I will briefly give an example of the extent to which this periodizing is forced. The book quotes Lacan's claim that, quote, there is no meta-language, unquote, from Seminar 14, which is during the heyday. Nonetheless, anyone who reads Lacan knows that the claim first appears in Seminar 5, before the heyday. Moreover, similarly, the book also quotes Lacan's claim that, quote, there is no other, unquote, from Seminar 14, though it first appears in Seminar 6, also before the heyday. These are not the only ones, but by most standards, such a method would prove untenable. By contrast, on a complete survey and careful scrutiny of the sources, there are 3 main contexts in which Lacan talks about contradiction. 1, Freud's statement that the unconscious knows no contradiction, quote unquote. 2, the contradictories in Aristotelian or rather scholastic logic. 3, the definition of paradox as a logically self-contradictory statement. As I will carefully and meticulously demonstrate, none of these discussions can be taken as concluding the book's claims in any period of Lacan's teaching. The first context, Freud, is the clearest point of entry into the issue of contradiction. The only properly ambiguous passage is Lacan's reading found in Seminar 1, where he claims that, for example, quote, discourse contains fundamentally contradiction, unquote. Under this angle, Freud's statement, quote, is not even completely true in terms of discourse, unquote. Even, indeed, not only is there, quote, no kind of reality that would be truly unthinkable, but also, quote, there are contradictions of the order of reality, unquote. Consequently, Lacan wonders, quote, why the unconscious would escape this sort of contradiction, unquote. If one reads this much, one would assume the following. The unconscious is contradictory because discourse is contradictory, indeed because reality is contradictory. Nonetheless, one must not only avoid any distinction between reality and the real, but also, for that matter, among discourse, reality, and the unconscious in order to conclude this. Such is especially the case if one reads the official edition of the passage, which changes words around to the point of complete disaster, such as reading, reality is defined by contradiction, not in the transcript. Out of its context, then, it's the only passage that substantiates the claim that, for Lacan, the real, the subject, or the unconscious is contradictory. Nonetheless, Lacan had already clarified shortly before, in Seminar 1, that, quote, during analysis developed in this register of error, something happens whereby truth erupts in this system, which is not the contradiction of discourse, unquote. He repeats this claim shortly after the passage as well. Quote, what we are supposed to detect is submitted to laws other than those of discourse, including this moment in which it encounters the contradiction, unquote. Simply then, it is not that the unconscious is contradiction, even in this early period, but instead that it cannot escape contradictions. Else we are merely empiricists, since we detect only the contradiction, not the laws other than those of discourse. Nonetheless, such is the only properly ambiguous passage. I'm going to abridge my analysis of Seminar 3 for clarity, but he, in that seminar, calls the likening of the suspension of non-contradiction to the simultaneous of opposites an analogy. He also says that it's out of the question that the signifier, quote, should designate 2 contradictory things simultaneously, unquote. And 3, that contradictions in formal logic are only, quote, experienced by the subject, unquote. Some is tantamount to saying that indeed the symbolic is not contradictory, even if the subject's discourse seems contradictory in experience. The analogy between discourse and the symbolic is a false one between the empirical and logical statuses of the unconscious. Now, in spite of the fact that this turn away from the extremely qualified approval of contradiction to this unequivocally dismissal of appraisal is before the heyday, Lacan only changes the emphasis of these points, not the points themselves. The main development on the suspension of non-contradiction is found in Seminar 14, in the middle of the heyday. At first, he merely reiterates that contradiction is a feature of discourse, quote, what is enunciated, unquote, rather than to the unconscious. But he also specifies the conclusion of the prior argument, namely that if, quote, the principle of non-contradiction has nothing to do with the real, unquote, then, quote, it is not that in this real there would be contradiction or non-contradiction, because it's not a question of contradiction in the real. I emphasize, it's not a question of contradiction in the real, unquote. In rendering an account of this absence of contradiction, he suggests a, quote, new negation, unquote, to formalize it. What is striking is not only the consistency of this passage with the prior argument, indeed what is not contradiction when truth erupts would be coextensive with the new negation, but also its almost identical repetition in a passage from Seminar 21 cited in the book. I quote the passage. Quote, what is important, what constitutes the real, is that, by way of logic, something happens, which demonstrates not that P and not P would be false simultaneously, but that neither one can be verified logically in any fashion, unquote. In the book, this passage is deployed to demonstrate that the post-Hegel Lacan is diverted from the real as contradiction to simply being beyond knowledge. It is already obvious that the first premise, that the real as contradiction, is false in light of the passage from Seminar 14, even during the heyday. Indeed, this deployment is yet another example of the attempt to force a periodization of Lacan that hardly in any manner at all whatsoever accords with the text. Nonetheless, let's not stop there. Already in the seminar, Lacan had made clear that far from simply endorsing, or the book would have it erroneously re-endorsing, non-contradiction, the point is that contradiction would be an imaginary truth about truth. Indeed, earlier in the seminar, truth, quote, is only founded on the supposition of the false, unquote. And on this account, quote, it is contradiction, unquote, but to this extent precisely, it is, quote, of the imaginary, unquote. The point is thus not that non-contradiction is true, but instead that the supposed truth of the real would be contradiction, were there to be a truth of the real, and for this reason is not viable. Put another way, contradiction, I can say, quote, quote, contradiction is only in the final account an artifice of suppletion, unquote, namely as a truth of the real, quote, but does not remain less true for that. Hence the second reason why the above cited passage is forced to the point of almost entirely deforming Lacan's point. It is not only that Lacan recedes from contradiction to the beyond of knowledge, but, to make the claim far stronger, that contradiction is the imaginary of the real. Last but certainly not least, there's a third reason that the deployment of the passage from Seminar 21 in the book is such a pernicious one, namely that it excises the sentence that follows it. The sentence makes quite clear, beyond a doubt, that the real is far from a beyond of knowledge if it is defined by way of logic rather than by way of contradiction. Quote, this impossible on both sides, it's there that the real, such that logic permits us to define it, is, only if we are capable of inventing it, unquote. Put quite simply, and in a fundamentally consistent relationship with Seminar 14, and indeed Lacan's corpus in its entirety, there's very much a logic that permits our defining the real and thus knowing it. Only it hasn't been invented, or rather is neither classical nor dialectical logic. Lacan already makes this point in Seminar 16 when he says that, quote, even in mathematical logic, one can not only do away with the principle of non-contradiction, but also, quote, construct a whole logic without making use of negation. That's in the heyday, Seminar 16. That's reiterated several times in the later years to track a further consistency, such as Seminar 19 and two conferences from 1973. Okay, I will sidestep the discussion of the second context, namely Aristotle's contradictories, because for Lacan, a contradictory, quote, is a something completely other than speaking of contradiction at the level of the principle of non-contradiction, unquote. Indeed, the existential negative that contradicts the universal affirmative is, quote, the state of exception and not any longer of contradiction, unquote. That's from Seminar 15. This, during the heyday. This suffices to demonstrate that the recourse to Aristotle is not useful either to support the book's thesis. Now let's turn to the third context, which requires one step further, but is ever more conclusive. In the book, the only justification for the claim that the real is the contradiction of the symbolic during the heyday, indeed the only one, there are no citations in this passage, only this passing reference, is a recourse to the so-called, quote, and I quote from the introduction, paradoxes of logic, Zeno's paradox, Russell's paradox, the liar's paradox, unquote. Leaving aside the fact that Lacan only mentions Zeno's paradox in Seminar 20, after the heyday, which is a straightforward self-sabotage of the periodizing, the liar's paradox and Russell's paradox are first discussed in Seminar 9, which we'll now investigate. Now, at first glance, such a justification would appear totally justified in and of itself on technical terms. The definition of a paradox is a logically self-contradictory statement. Indeed, Lacan accepts this definition in Seminar 9. For example, quote, in one case like the other, quote, unquote, of Russell's paradox, quote, it is going to fall into contradiction, unquote. Though he observes that it is only according to appearance, quote, unquote, that there be, quote, what they can call a contradiction, unquote. Regardless, in other contexts, he even equates the terms in a quite colloquial manner, along with others such as antinomy, seminar 15. Nonetheless, there's a big problem with this justification. Lacan claims almost everywhere, and as programmatically as anywhere, that none of these paradoxes is a paradox, in fact. Indeed, for Lacan in Seminar 21, after the heyday, yet capturing its nucleus in a way that will be demonstrated in a moment, quote, the paradox is only a paradox of a predicative logic, unquote, not of the logic that Lacan is inventing. At the beginning of Seminar 9, Lacan remarks that, quote, it's only to the extent that these two lines of statement and utterance, which is effectively to say unconscious and discourse, so that would take a few steps to demonstrate, quote, are knotted and confused that we can find ourselves before such a paradox. So it's only to the extent that unconscious and discourse, in effect, are knotted and confused that we can find ourselves before such a paradox, as, say, the liar's paradox. He makes this point quite clear in Seminar 11 by calling it a, quote, so-called paradox, unquote, 3 times, and remarking a bit later that, quote, there isn't the slightest, namely paradox. Similarly, in Seminar 11, and thus I remind the listener during the heyday, Lacan also calls Russell's paradox a, quote, so-called paradox, unquote. Even more forcefully, he contends that it is, quote, what one calls falsely a paradox, unquote, since, quote, it is not at all a paradox, unquote. This is in Seminar 14. Indeed, he goes further. The, quote, the contradiction that it's about at this level at which Russell's paradox stems precisely from the fact that I say it, unquote. Also from Seminar 14, during the heyday, and very much consistent with the overall trajectory. Both of these passages clearly demonstrate the hyperconsistency across Lacan's oeuvre. Contradiction is a feature of discourse, i.e. the result of saying the paradox, and even of meaning, not of the unconscious or, for that matter, the real. Indeed, Lacan merely continues calling these paradoxes so-called paradoxes after the heyday as well, such as Seminar 18. He even refers in Seminar 19b to, quote, the illusion that in this field of psychoanalysis, something has been discovered that one could call analogous to what one calls in logic a paradox, unquote. In any case, Lacan is yet more explicit during the heyday about the absence of contradiction in these so-called paradoxes, namely in its topological correlates. In the absurdly canonical final lesson of Seminar 11, Lacan unambiguously remarks that the interiorate, quote, absolutely doesn't imply any contradiction, unquote. He then extends this point to the topology of the projective plane in Seminar 13 by noting that one constructs a spherical limit, quote, without seeing there any contradiction, unquote. Moreover, and I'm extending the scope slightly, but nonetheless, in Seminar 12, Lacan extends these statements to other supposed examples of paradoxes, both Chomsky's colorless green ideas seep furiously and to the classic philosophical case of a round square. Quote, the so-called contradiction in these examples is not at all in reality a contradiction, unquote. Put quite simply, no paradox, no contradiction. So, one must ask, if the term paradox is insufficient to found the equation of the real and contradiction, then what might be? Let's try the quite popular term of inconsistency. Now, in brief, a system is called inconsistent if the axioms can prove a statement and its negation. Russell's paradox is the identification of the inconsistency specifically of Frege's Foundations of Arithmetic. Put another way, the result of inconsistency is contradiction and, all in all, the ability to prove any statement whatsoever. Now, it is quite in vogue to say that the symbolic for Lacan is inconsistent, but such would be misleading to the point of being unrigorous, as I will explain in a moment. There are 2 levels on which one could ostensibly claim that the symbolic is inconsistent. The first is that for the signifier, A is not A. Hence, supposedly why Lacan speaks of, quote, the false consistency of A equals A, unquote, in Seminar 9. The real would then be this inconsistency of the signifier. Now, there's one passage that, if not read properly, would appear to justify the connection between the supposed inconsistency of the signifier and contradiction. Quote, the signifier not only isn't submitted to the so-called law of contradiction, but even is properly speaking the support thereof, namely that A is usable as a signifier in spite of the fact that A is not A. Taken by itself, this passage would appear to claim that the signifier is itself self-contradictory, i.e. the signifier is the support of contradictions and thus abides by the law not of contradiction, but instead even by a law of contradiction itself. Nonetheless, the refutation is found immediately in the above passage only as explained by another one. The signifier, I quote, being always different from itself, A is not A, by no means can one make the same appear if not on the side of the real. The real, to the extent of being distinct from the signifier, is the same, unquote. Put quite simply then, though the signifier supports contradiction and thus isn't submitted to the law of non-contradiction, the real of the signifier's difference from itself is not at all contradiction, but rather sameness. This real is not contradiction, but sameness, I reiterate. To push the argument one step further, by the way, this is all in the heyday. Note that Lacan is as clear as can be in this seminar and everywhere after that a signifier doesn't signify itself, which he formalizes as it's not containing itself. If Russell's paradox were contradiction, then the signifier would be opposed to such an inconsistency, because it doesn't contain itself. Hence, in Seminar 14, why the symbolic is described as, quote, incontestably consistent, unquote. Shifting terms but maintaining the same general line of reasoning, Lacan remarks after the heyday in Seminar 19b that, quote, non-contradiction could not in any fashion suffice to found truth, which doesn't mean that it wouldn't be desirable, even requirable, but assuredly not that it would be sufficient. Indeed, non-contradiction is necessary, but not sufficient to the extent that it still pertains to a logic of classes, not sets. The second level is that the other is inconsistent, hence supposedly why Lacan claims that, quote, this field of the other is, one says technically, not consistent, unquote, in Seminar 16. The real would then be the inconsistency of the other. The curious thing is that Lacan never actually claims that the other is inconsistent, only a few times that it is, quote, not consistent, unquote, as above cited. Moreover, he only claims non-consistence in this seminar, not in any other, and indeed qualifies it profusely. Conversely, Lacan's emphasis from beginning to end is less on consistency, in fact, than on consistency. For example, in Seminar 14, Lacan claims that, quote, it's more worthwhile to direct oneself down the path of what I call a logical, quote, consistent system, unquote. The reason, as discussed in Seminar 16, is that indeed, in a formal axiomatic system, inconsistency implies completeness and inversely, such as Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. What the symbolic is not is complete, and if the symbolic were consistent, then it would be complete. Lacan's first recourse to inconsistency is thus very precise in the seminar, set 16. Quote, there's no possibility for the entire consistency of discourse, unquote. Hence, discourse is consistent, only it is not complete. And if anything, the semblance of completeness of discourse comes from the appearance of contradiction. The irony, conversely, is that one cannot prove the consistency or inconsistency of a formal axiomatic system from within, such as Gödel's second incompleteness theorem. Hence, both consistency and inconsistency remain strictly presuppositions that cannot be proven within the system. By the way, both of these theorems are discussed at length in the 6th lesson of Seminar 16. I'm not quoting. The precision is maintained in Lacan's further recourse to inconsistency. Quote, this field of the other doesn't assure the consistency of discourse, unquote. Hence, discourse is not only consistent, but its completeness is what prevents any proof from inside that this discourse is consistent. Once again, maintaining his hyper-consistency, no pun intended, Lacan reminds after the heyday in Seminar 23 that, quote, one can say very diverse things, each one being contradictory on occasion, and that from there a reality emerges. But this is precisely what has never been proven, unquote. Indeed, one could prove everything in a self-contradictory system except for the fact that it is in fact self-contradictory. To tie the above 2 points together, take yet another passage from Seminar 16. Quote, it is the incidence of the signifier, the very incidence of the mark, the incidence of what I have just called now the unary trait that gives the gap in the organism its consistency, unquote. Put quite simply, it is the consistency of, let's say it, the letter, not its contradiction, that suspends all contradiction in the real. To summate all of the above, let it suffice to cite Lacan's final reference to the term contradiction, not at all coincidentally in the same lesson of Seminar 25, in which he claims that what I'm doing here is philosophy. I quote, the unconscious doesn't know contradiction. That's indeed the extent to which it's needed that the analyst operate by way of something that would not make a foundation on contradiction, unquote. To the extent that this reference is the conclusion of his many comments on the topic, one could say that Lacanian philosophy is, properly speaking, coextensive with the rejection of both non-contradiction and contradiction alike, or at least a foundation on it. I believe that I'm now in a position to diagnose one source of the confusion, the total and utter conflation of the terms impossibility and contradiction. To illustrate this conflation, note that the book claims throughout that the unconscious desire is contradictory, when in fact Lacan offers the following definition of desire as early as 1958, which, it should be noted, is before the heyday. Quote, desire is none other than the impossibility of this speech, unquote. A definition that is maintained as late as 1975, quote, after the heyday. It is impossible to satisfy the wish, unquote. Indeed, during the heyday, Lacan goes further, equating desire not with consistency, but by means of the, quote, homology between these gaps of logic in the structure of desire, unquote, on the contrary, quote, an undecidable on which consistency depends, unquote. Such incidentally also demonstrates that Lacan never stops talking about desire, which on a quite cursory search is a term in every seminar from 1 to 7, against the claim about desire in the book. Indeed, one of Lacan's most canonical, albeit misunderstood, equations is between the real and the impossible, which, under a certain angle, is that of the symbolic. I can't go through the entire genesis of this definition from Seminar 9, but let it suffice to say that one cannot substitute the word impossibility for the word contradiction, since none of its large-scale readings, that is the book's large-scale readings, hold on this account either. For many philosophers, for modern mathematical logic, and indeed for contradiction, rather for Lacan, excuse me, I'm a bit tired, contradiction is not equivalent to impossibility. There is some evidence to suggest that for Lacan, the two are more or less opposites, and will be seen in the proceedings. First, note that only in Aristotelian, or yet more precisely scholastic logic, is a properly formal impossibility a contradiction, for example, a round square. Nonetheless, there are multifarious real impossibilities that are not contradictions, for example, a centaur. Put another way, there are no strictly real contradictions since, unlike impossibility, there's only a formal contradiction. Yet more specifically, impossibility, not contradiction, is a modal category. Nor in modern mathematical logic, from which Lacan draws in a manner 100 times provable his entire ontology, are the two identical. Impossibility is a semantic concept, since it refers to a statement that is not obtained in any model of a theory. Contradiction is a syntactic concept, by contrast, since it refers to the co-obtainment of a statement and its negation. Put quite simply then, an impossibility is the absence of a statement, while a contradiction is the coexistence of two statements. Consider, for example, that it is very much possible to construct an inconsistent system that produces contradictions. Nothing is impossible about it, including the proof of any statement at all whatsoever, while in a consistent system, there are statements that are impossible to produce without contradictions. The two are independent. Finally, and this is what I'm going to spend the last few minutes on, it is wrong against the letter of the text and even its strictly philosophical foundations and references to begin a reading of Lacan by way of the conflation of the two terms. For example, note that this modal definition of the real as impossible is extracted quite strictly from the first order concepts of contrariety and contradiction in an extremely famous passage from Seminar 11. I quote, this function of the impossible is not to be approached without prudence, like any function that is presented under a negative form. The best fashion to approach them is not to take them by way of negation, since that is going to carry us to the question of the possible. The possible is not forcibly the contrary of the impossible. End quote. Thus, not only does Lacan reject that the impossible would be in contrariety to, leaving aside its being in contradiction with, the possible, but also that it would be a negation in the first place. Already, this explains both Lacan's hesitation to speak of the suspension of law of non-contradiction purely and simply in terms of contradiction. The suspension might very well be an expression of an impossibility, but one that requires a new negation to formalize. Again, no proper discontinuity between the heyday and post-heyday, in spite of increasingly marked emphasis on the opposition. Again, the real is impossible is neither non-contradiction, quote, the consistency of the real is something other than what qualifies in language as non-contradiction, unquote, from Seminar 22, nor contradiction, quote, what I call the impossible as the real is limited to non-contradiction, unquote. This consistency, Seminar 24, this consistency is instead a coherence that very well permits its being situated so long as it is not overdetermined by contradiction. Quote, the notion of impossible appears to me to be situated by a certain impossibility that is coherent, unquote, from 1975. For a wham-bam measure of this continuity, note that he calls psychoanalysis, quote, the science of the impossible, unquote, as forcefully in 1966 and as in 1977. What is certainly beyond a doubt is that Lacan, after the heyday, never claims that the real is simply impossible to know. As put in 1975, the result of, quote, our experience of knowledge, unquote, is that, quote, there is knowledge of the real, unquote. Though this knowledge does not say the truth of the real, no such truth about truth exists, it is still knowledge by formalizing an impossibility. The project of formalization in these later years is that of formalizing the real in modern mathematical logic. Indeed, as also put in 1975, this specific logic is, quote, the science of the real in order to permit its access by the mode of the impossible, unquote. One can see in a small number of passages how this real as impossible is not inaccessible to knowledge. What is impossible for the later Lacan is not simply undeterminable as so long as it is formalized. In Seminar 17, he offers, quote, only determined at the level of our formalized truth, unquote, as, quote, a strict meaning of the word impossible, unquote. Yet more specifically, the real as impossible is properly speaking determined in mathematics. In Seminar 19b, Lacan programmatically claims that, quote, there's no locus in which it would be more true that the real is the impossible, unquote, than mathematics. If the real is impossible is determined in mathematics and even demonstrated by it, then it is very much thinkable by means of formalization. From Seminar 19, quote, the impossibility demonstrated is not strictly an impossible of thought because it's the only demonstrable, unquote. Nonetheless, such is true precisely to the extent that one cannot cognize the real directly, but rather articulate this real in a knowledge. As put in 1975, quote, when one cognizes the real, it's impossible to penetrate, unquote. Nonetheless, this thinking by means of formalization, regardless of whether it is cognition, is still a manner of comprehending or literally grappling with the real, namely a structure. As put in 1972, quote, this dimension of an impossible that goes incidentally or incisively to the point of comprehending the properly logical impasse is what one calls structure, unquote. Indeed, as put in 1974, quote, it's only in the impossible that we have an idea of what would not be a real that would not be phantasmatic, unquote. Nonetheless, the real as impossible does not cease to happen in experience. Another intimation of the book. It is not a mere limit of knowledge. For example, in Seminar 21, Lacan programmatically claims that, quote, it's the impossible that happens in any first encounter with the sexual rapport, unquote. Even, as put in 1974, the mere existence of gadgets, i.e. products of knowledge in the real, are the disproof of the, quote, so-called inaccessibility of the real, so-called. All in all, as late as 1975, Lacan writes that, quote, the unconscious is the impossible. This is his emphasis. The unconscious is the impossible. Black on white, the impossible is, namely as the unconscious, and therefore is not inaccessible. Nonetheless, I suspect that there's another source of confusion, which is lateral to the conflation of impossibility and contradiction. In contrast to the plethora of evidence, the source of the reading that for the Lacan of the 1960s there is contradiction and it is the subject is not Lacan himself, but rather Jacques-Alain Miller's attempt at formalizing the logic of the signifier in terms of Frege, which Lacan considers, though rejects, both understatedly when presented in Seminar 12 and quite forthrightly in Seminar 16 and later. To put it simply, in Frege's Foundations of Arithmetic, the one that conduces to Russell's so-called paradox, the contradictory concept of non-identical to itself subsumes no objects and thus is assigned the number 0. According to Miller, this 0 is the subject to the extent that through succession, which is tantamount to the repetition of the power set operation on the void set, it is what is sutured to the chain of signifiers analogized with the series of numbers, and therefore is contradiction. In contrast to Miller's formalization, Lacan consistently defines the object A as the void set, with the indubitably crucial qualification that the void set is not defined as the contradictory concept of non-identical to itself, which indeed is not a set but a class, but rather axiomatized as the empty set. In spite of its formative and overdetermining influence on Slavoj Žižek, not only is this transcoding never advocated by Lacan and indeed is disregarded in favor of a Kantorian axiomatization, but also, as noted by Alain Badiou, nothing could be less dialectical than saying that nothing is non-identical to itself. Thus, to say that the subject is the real contradiction of the symbolic or whatever is to be a Millerian, not a Lacanian of any period. 3 minutes. So what is all of the above tantamount to? I would say it is tantamount to the confusion of A, the real of the symbolic, which in experience appears as contradiction to ordinary logic, and B, the real of language, the letter, which is neither contradictory nor, properly speaking, non-contradictory. And this conflation between the symbolic order and language is happens throughout the book. Only the latter, not the former, is impossible. Namely, impossible to think totally symbolically, but nonetheless not impossible to think at all through the letter. The former, aside from a few properly ambiguous passages, is marginal in Lacan's corpus, while the latter is abundant from beginning to end and indeed constitutes his final judgment. No wonder then that the book, by conflating the two, or to be frank, by privileging the former over the latter to the point of obliteration, includes the thing as a concept, the only strictly unambiguous expression in my mind of the real of the symbolic, but not the unary trait, the real of language and the indisputably ontological foundation of Lacan's project. Just look at how many times Lacan mentions the thing versus the unary trait in 2 seminars and 2 writings, as opposed to, and this is no exaggeration, 1,000 in the entire corpus. So basically, it's all reducible to the following. If you take the real of the symbolic to be the real of language, and given that for Lacan over time, given that he exercises any ambiguity that it is not the real is impossible, it can only appear that Lacan loses his grasp on the real. But nothing could be further from the case. This argument not only hinges on a dubious at best interpretation, I would prefer to say impression, and a borderline anti-philosophical reception of Kant and Hegel, but also by bypassing almost all of his references to the key terminology and philosophers in question, a manner of spitting on Lacan's corpse as much as on his corpus. So, frankly, I'm concerned not only about what it espouses about Lacan, but also about what it encourages by way of reading Lacan. I think it does more harm than good. And thus, to conclude, I'll permit myself the following. In this book on Hegel, on his book on Hegel, McGowan gives a short account of Peter Singer's introduction to Hegel, and in a greatly justified manner, I believe, argues that it makes no sense at all whatsoever. He concludes the account by remarking, quote, "Given Singer's decidedly anti-Hegelian utilitarianism, it is difficult to avoid the paranoid suspicion that he wrote this introduction to Hegel as a subversive gesture, as a way of undermining the philosophical enemy from within by poisoning young minds with the image of Hegel as a moron," unquote. Nonetheless, one could turn the paranoid suspicion on the author himself. Given McGowan's decidedly anti-Lacanian glorification of contradiction, did he not write this introduction to make Lacan seem even more like a moron than people already think? I rest my case. Thank you.
Paris, could you mute by chance? Well, Paris, that was quite something. Again, just so folks are clear with the format here, people were invited to present as they wish on the book. Paris has made a presentation, which, Todd, we do not expect you to respond to all of these points, but as you wish. I don't know how much time you have, Paris, or Todd, what your thoughts are. How much time do you have, Paris?
I have until I get tapped on the shoulder. So,
okay. Please.
Well, for one thing, I don't have all night, Daniel. So wasn't he supposed to go at 4:15?
He is.
Yeah.
He is.
So
yeah.
I mean, that went quite long.
It did go over, Paris.
But
yeah.
I'll just, I mean, I don't know where to even start. I'll just start with one thing, I guess. And then I don't know what else to say. Clearly I'm not hostile to Lacan, and there's not a secret subversive. That was a joke about Peter Singer, not a serious point. Just to start with that last point, but about the idea that, so let me just give people an example of where I see contradiction operative in the second period. And again, I would just say, this will actually respond to the very first point, that I think when one is constructing an interpretation of a thinker, one doesn't necessarily follow the thinker's lead in how they imagine their thought. So, for instance, Lacan's references to Hegel are I think we can say almost 100% are not necessarily references to Hegel, but and this is a point that Milad and Dolores made, that they're references to Kojève. And so it's not, so to say, oh, when he's saying something about Hegel, you got to take him at his word. When he's saying that this, in the later period, I'm turning to Hegel. Well, no, he doesn't. He might think that he's doing that, but what an interpretation is trying to say, well, no, what the person is just laying out of their thought isn't necessarily what their thought is doing. Just like Paris has tried to say, I don't know what my thought is doing. That's true of any thinker. So, and that's what an interpretation is an attempt to do. In my book on Hegel, I was trying to get at something that probably Hegel wouldn't himself have articulated about his thought. And I don't think, of course, Lacan himself thinks, no, my thought is consistent all the way down the line. It is true that the unary trait is missing, and I don't know what to say about that other than as I said to Stephanie, I had a word, there was a limit on the number of things I could talk about. I don't find a lot of what the book was supposed to do was to show the importance that Lacan has had among theorists subsequent to him. And it seems to me the case that Das Ding, for instance, which appears more than twice, has had a more of a bearing on subsequent thinkers than the unary trait has, for instance. So it doesn't strike me as a concept. Not that I'm saying it's unimportant in Lacan's own thinking. I'm just saying in terms of what the impact, the import that thinking has had on people, I don't see references to the unary trait, not in my thought. I don't see it that often in the thought of other thinkers. So that's why that was missing. I'm not going to respond to the discussion of consistency or inconsistency because that's not in the book. Let me just give an example of what I mean by contradiction when and this is, okay, maybe it is, I'm importing a Hegelian understanding into the middle period of Lacan. I don't think it's it's certainly not the influence of Malher. If anything, I've been overly influenced by Slavoj in terms of my take on Lacan. But as Daniel and I were talking about earlier, I think the importance that I give to Kant is not an importance that Slavoj would give him for sure. I mean, this is something we've talked about. But let me just give you an example. So the way the gaze is discussed in Seminar 11, right? And that seems to me, again, he's not using the term, but that seems to me like precisely the way that Hegel understands contradiction, right? That the subject sees itself out in somewhere, sees its desire somewhere out in the other. And this encounter with its desire is akin to Hegel's notion of the identity of identity and difference, which is his understanding of contradiction. So that was probably the guiding idea for me to see that. But and I do take this point that the question about impossibility versus contradiction is I think it is, right. It is certainly true that Lacan doesn't think he's talking about contradiction. But I think oftentimes when he's talking about the real as impossible, he's talking about something that occurs within this point of symbolic contradiction. And I think that it seems to me like that okay, he's not using the language. I admit that. But what strikes me is that that's what's happening, that he's trying to show whether he's using, again, I think if he had a certain reading of Hegel that wasn't available to him, I think he would be using the terminology of contradiction because that is what is, if he had this reading of Hegel, that would be available to him in a way that it wasn't. So that's my impression. I mean, again, I don't know. It's an introduction. So if it simplifies, it simplifies. And if it omits things, it omits things. I don't know what to say about that. I'm not trying to turn people against Lacan. I'm certainly trying to find a way to make him accessible and useful. I do think that there is a split between people that find the turn, I think it is a turn, the mathematical turn, that they find that incredible. Like that's where their Lacan's bread is buttered. That is not where I think his bread is buttered. So that's my initial impressions. In terms of where the quotations come from, I guess, I mean, Yeah, I mean, if right, there is no meta language appears throughout. That's not a point that I was saying. That was germane only to a certain middle period. I think there obviously are certain ideas that run throughout, which I don't think refutes the idea that there's a periodization at work. So that's it.
Excellent. Well, we are over time, Paris. I don't know if you wanted to say something briefly on a positive note, perhaps.
It doesn't have to be positive, Daniel.
I mean, well, I mean,
whatever.
No, Paris, why don't you unmute?
Well, first of all, I did give a few positive notes, and
that's true, and I appreciate that.
So let's not discount that. And I took it very seriously and read it very well. I just will say very briefly that I think what you've effectively admitted to is that it's an introduction and not even an uncontroversial one, in my opinion, because I do a PhD with Slavoj, have my own opinion about his work. An introduction to Slavoj Žižek and his reading of Lacan, and I don't think it's substantiated to be a reading of Lacan.
That's not totally fair, especially given the Kantian primacy, by the way. But maybe.
In any case, so.
Well, I didn't admit to that. I mean, I just said that the link between Lacan and Hegel, I think that is one of the things that Slavoj made evident. That's what I think. Yeah, okay, that's controversial for a number of people, but I think that is, and the notion, to me, I find this just incorrect. The notion that somehow deflates Lacan's originality or undermines his thought in some way. I think the opposite. I think it's a way of reclaiming his importance as a thinker, or asserting his importance as a thinker, precisely because he's intervening in what I think is the significant philosophical movement of modernity. So I think it's really, I wrote it in an attempt to give him an extreme amount of credit for being one of the few 20th century thinkers to really take German idealism seriously rather than fleeing from it, because I think there's a whole line of thought, almost every line of thought. I think Marxism, structuralism, phenomenology, it's a flight from German idealism. And so part of what I wanted to do in the book was to say, okay, here's someone who not only wasn't fleeing from this incredibly fecund philosophical moment, but was actually developing its line of thinking even more. So far from a secret subversion of Lacan or some kind of attempt to undermine him, it's an attempt to assert his importance as a thinker. I think there's enough in it that's totally distinct from Slavoj that I don't think it could be called an introduction to Slavoj Žižek. For one thing, yeah, anyway, I'm not going to go on. So we've already gone too long.
Great. Paris, thank you very much. Enjoy the wedding. Thank you for your intervention, and we'll be in touch. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Mikey Downs to Emancipations. I think this is actually your first time on our channel, Mikey. Welcome.
Thanks.
Just a quick intro to, in the event folks don't know about Mikey's work. Mikey is developing a book that is putting into dialogue the work of the Slovenian school with the CCRU and with accelerationism through a kind of very interesting commitment to Marxism as well. And Mikey and I are philosophical comrades. It's great to have you here. Did so you finished Todd's new book?
Yeah.
Excellent. We want to hear your thoughts, critical, constructive, and otherwise. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, Todd.
Hey, how you doing?
Okay, so, and this one, I'm gonna say some things as I go along, but you know us, I'd rather keep it in more of a dialogue form. So I want to make points, and then instead of like waiting till the end for you to chime in, we'll just kind of
Okay.
we'll do our thing for a little bit, and
Okay.
then
Okay.
we'll be done. Okay, so what I think is great about your book is that it does give us a chance to return to the fundamentals of Lacanian theory and rethink them, situate them in a new way, and perhaps think them with even more philosophical consistency. And so I think that's always a great thing, to be able to go back to the basics, reassess, and connect concepts that might have otherwise not been connected. If I have a critique of the book, it's this. I wish there had been a chapter on superego, but as you were telling Stephanie, like with the clinical structures, word limit, you can only do so much. But so it's, if you want to call that a critique, okay, fine. But really what it is, I wish there had been the thing on superego, but it also makes sense that it's not there. Because yeah, we all know Lacan says the thing in Seminar 20, nothing commands us to enjoy except superego. But superego is really Slavoj's concept, and then you've taken it and developed it in your own way. But superego, I think, for both of us is more of how we think of it in terms of how Slavoj developed it, based on that Lacanian insight. And so I think your work overall, starting from early on and into dissatisfaction, but up to, enjoying what we don't have, and especially in pure excess, you've constantly been rethinking superego. And I think it's the way you think superego in your other works that helps to, it's almost the missing signifier, so to speak, of the book, because I think your critiques of the later stuff for discourses, sexuation, symptom, I think there's a potential to think some of the stuff Lacan's getting at there, and other Lacanians who find Lacan important. I think there's a way to think some of this stuff in terms of superego, which they don't do, that makes sense of it without getting into some of the muddying the theory, perhaps, in ways that you're not a fan of. So, yeah, I think anybody who's familiar with your work goes, well, superego isn't here. Where's that at? Right? Okay. So I guess what I've been trying to think through and develop in a larval form based on your work and Slavoj's work is this idea that I'm calling superego oriented neurosis. And the question for me is, we have this stuff in the later Lacan symptom that Jacques Lacan takes up, and it inspires the idea of ordinary psychosis. Other thinkers will talk about generalized foreclosure. And all of it is trying to respond to changes in subjectivity, changes in symptoms that clinicians are seeing develop, right? And so my thing is, though, what has fundamentally occurred in capitalism is superego taking the position of authority over big other, or over a traditional master signifier. And the question is, what effect does that have on a typical neurotic? Can the inversion from big other being primary to superego being primary account for some of these changes we see in subjects and symptoms? And so, yeah, I think your work in particular leaves us with this possibility of rethinking some of this stuff in terms of superego. So I'll pause there and see what you have to say.
Yeah, I love this. What you're saying. I think it's so good. And I think this is really almost you more than me. I know you keep not saying that, but, so this would be an example, just as the part of my response to Paris is, if it was a book on Slavoj, there would have been a section on superego. And so
Right.
part of what I mean, superego does not have that large a role in Lacan's thinking. And it's more Slavoj who develops it later. And you're right. For me, it's really important. And I think you're right. And I think maybe I kind of got caught up in this periodization, and I really ran with it. And maybe that was an error, because I think maybe you're right that there are ways in which you can think I do think, though, that it does lead to this concept of ordinary psychosis, which I'm like you, I'm resistant to. But I do think it's interesting to think. I certainly think that that what is happening when under capitalism, for instance, is a sort of or recent, I don't know, a shift from big other to superego that you're describing. And it would be, and I think this is true, that is the cause of these, what appear to be psychotic, isolated,
Islands of jouissance.
islands of jouissance. Right. I mean, I think that is but I think I think the problem isn't the problem. And I think you agree with this. So the problem is that you can't take the people's own experience of themselves as truthful, right? Like, I think it seems to me that's the problem. Like, you can't, I think a lot of people experience themselves as an island of jouissance, right? Like, that's all there is for them. But that, I think it fails to see, this is true, just because of the power of capitalist society, it fails to see the power of that capitalist superego. And I think, again, I think you've done more said more about this than anybody, that it's really that is the primary function. And you're right, in Pure Excess, I talk about this a little bit, that superegoic imperative is really, and it's interesting to me that even Marx kind of gets that, right? Like, he doesn't obviously have a concept of superego, but he sort of sees the way in which, when he says accumulate, that's Moses and the prophets, he's basically getting at that link that would become evident only with really Lacan's analysis of superego, I think, because I don't think Freud really gets to that. I think it's only in Seminar 20 that Lacan does. And then, as you said, Slavoj really takes that up first in Metastases of Enjoyment, I think, where he has that great third chapter called Superego by Default, which is really the place where he develops it the best.
Right. Although, like I say, I mean, you can find these spots in his work where he does make an association or a quick connection between superego and capital, but it's you, and I see some of this in Samo Tomsic, but you're the one who really kind of forges this and takes it, because like when Slavoj talks about it, he's talking about inherent transgression, right, and how superego relates to that. And as far as I know, even as great as I love, that chapter is in Metastases, I don't know if there's a chapter anywhere where
that
he
links
like
it to
the whole
capital.
thing's focused on capital.
Yeah, I don't think I think you're right about that.
And so I think that's your contribution. And so the thing is, I guess, look, none of us are denying that fragmentation, atomization, hyper individualization occurs in our time, and there's an emphasis on enjoyment. Question is, does symptom better account for this, or does superego? And so there's a couple different things that we'll talk about. So for example, okay, the enjoy of the superego is a type of master signifier and not a symptom. Enjoy is a master signifier that imposes on all of us a universal collective duty. The collective duty to not have a collective duty, but instead a collective duty to have a personal duty to our own most idiosyncratic enjoyment. But the collective duty to not have a collective duty is still an interpolated duty nonetheless, though a very twisted and perplexing one. The enjoy is a master signifier that demands us to not have any master signifier. But this is where dialectics exigency comes in, where, but the fact that there is some sort of collective duty at play, even though it's one that denies collective duty, nonetheless, it's not, as you describe symptom, it's really trying to make up for the absence of the paternal function, the lack of a traditional master signifier. What happens if we have a master signifier that's telling us not to have a master signifier, right, so to speak? What kind of libidinal situation does that put an individual in?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's really true. Although, what do you make of, because I think you're right that we do have this pressure not to have a master signifier, because that would be the giving up of our enjoyment. But isn't it interesting that one of the things that when I wrote that book, Pure Excess, which I'm much more invested in than the one we're talking about today, is that one of the things that struck me and it first came to me when I was writing that book is that the movement of history is from capitalism to fascism. It's not from capitalism to communism. And so I wonder about what you said in that light, because there is this real pressure not to have a master signifier. And you could even say the master signifier is the pressure not to have a master signifier. But at the same time, the overwhelming libidinal response to capitalism, it's one of two things, right? It's either do that and try to enjoy without, or find a new master signifier that you can really invest yourself in.
Or quilting point, if we want to use your
right, maybe right. But so that, right, like I think that just like think of the around the world, like that's the way Putin functions, that's the way Trump functions, right? Like they're filling in for that, for what's missing in the capitalist world. So I do wonder,
while remaining super egoic.
Well, right. I mean, that is the interesting thing, right? Like are they, I guess that is your point, right? That they're not really functioning as a new master signifier precisely because they have this they all have this super egoic effect.
I'm tempted to go in the Baudrillardian direction and say it kind of simulates master signifier while letting us continue to because nothing seems to truly click together a new collectivity. Nothing seems to do that. It's still more of just an amplification of political jouissance.
Right. No, I think that's right. I think you're right about that.
It's just that, the thing is, if we go in the direction of using symptom, doesn't it mean that a society of subjects who have stabilized themselves via an idiosyncratic symptom, how do they form a collectivity? How do they identify with each other on the basis of universal lack?
Right. I don't think they can, for one thing. But isn't it? I mean, that's one of the problems of it. But isn't the other problem that you don't see the way in which you already are formed as a collective, right? Like I think that's what you're getting at, right? That you miss the role of this superego in forming everything about your precious individuality and particularity, right? I think it's the difference between, I mean, it seems to me like it really, the difference between particularity and singularity is for me really important. And I think it really speaks to that, right? Like, I think this like isolated, this island of jouissance is particular, but it misses all the way in which the capitalist imperative is shaping it. Whereas singularity has to emerge through the encounter with that collective structure, that you, rather than just turning away from it. I mean, I think that's what's happening, right? Like people, it's not that they're not affected by the structure. It's that they're just closing their eyes to it. And that seems to me, we shouldn't theoretically accept that experience is an authentic experience of what it means to be a subject today.
Do you think it's interesting that in Seminar 23, where he develops the concept of symptom, there's no mention of superego or capitalism?
Right. There's none of either. And it's, joy, like the other people have said this, but it's sad that it's James Joyce that's the figure. I mean, you're going to go awry if you pick Finnegan's Wake as a text that you're going to use as a reference point, I think, right? Compared to Seminar 7, where it's Antigone, or Seminar 6, where it's Hamlet, I think.
Well, and okay, so I mean, isn't one of the benefits of viewing this through superego instead of symptom is that we can interpret superego. We're not supposed to interpret the symptom.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, because this is a point that Anna Kornblue has made, I think, relative to today's capitalist world. How else does that imperative to accumulate function? It functions by an imperative not to interpret, right? To take everything in its immediacy, not to put some mediating interpretive structure on it. And I think with her that the real the gesture necessary today is interpretation. And I think anything that psychoanalytically cuts against that necessity of interpreting is a problem. It's problematic.
So, I mean, Slavoj says in Living in the End Times, how then does psychoanalysis stand with regard to enjoyment? Its great task is to break the hold over us of the superego injunction to enjoy. That is, to help us include in the freedom to enjoy also the freedom not to enjoy, the freedom from enjoyment. Well, that would necessitate interpretation.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think though, the pressure to, don't you think there's something he's a little off with that statement? Because it's fine, freedom from enjoyment, but it's not, the pressure to enjoy actually is a pressure not to enjoy, right? I mean, that seems to me.
Yeah, the thing is, it actually enhances desire in the like while trying to foreclose desire.
Right. Like I always think of that command to enjoy, like I'm a terrible insomniac, so this works for me. That
Right.
If I say to myself, I've got to go to sleep, that is a certain way that I will not sleep. I'll sleep 0 minutes that night, right? And I think that command to enjoy functions the same way, right? Like it is actually I think I hate this book, but I develop it a little bit in End of Dissatisfaction, I think, right? Like that the command to enjoy is really the ultimate erection of a barrier to enjoyment in the most subtle form, because it's precisely because it commands it. So saying you don't have to enjoy is actually a way, I would just twist Slavoj's thing around a little bit, right? Like it's saying you don't have to enjoy, it's giving you those space, freedom to enjoy, right? Like I think that's how I would think of it.
I just want to finish up this line and then I'll stop. But
Okay.
real quick, isn't it this? If we cannot interpret the symptom so as to replace it with a master signifier, then aren't we stuck inside of a positive feedback loop that produces more and more libidinal solipsism? And if that's the direction we're headed in, then you kind of step back and think, well, if super egoic capital is responsible for the decline of paternal authority, traditional S1, and if the decline of paternal authority forces subjects to rely on an uninterpretable symptom in order to compensate, then the goal must be to undermine super egoic authority via interpretation.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think it's not only, what you're talking about is not only theoretically challenging and contra the prevailing doxa, but it's even politically, I think, problematic for people, because we're so inculcated today with the idea that people know what they want, right? Or they know who they are, or what they identify as is what they are. Like that is just become, to challenge that doxa is to really be in a politically risky territory. And I think the whole point of psychoanalysis is to say, just like you're saying, is to say, no. And this is true of me, just as like you and all of us, like, no, we don't know. Like someone else, and isn't the fundamental idea of psychoanalysis, someone else knows us better than we do. And that's why you have to interpret. And I have to interpret even my own situation and what I think most about myself. Like that, even the thing I think is most crucial to me, that has to be the thing subject to interpretation. So I think, the emphasis that you're placing on it, the link, I think you're absolutely right to make this link between superego and interpretation, right? And that, whereas Saint-Thome is what resists interpretation, and that is what I feel is problematic about it as a concept.
Do you think that would inevitably lead to a kind of clinical defeatism?
Or just, like, I don't know about the clinic. I'm not going to speak about it, but theoretically, it's a form of capitulation to the ruling capitalist system, I think. So I feel like that's really to be honest, this is probably what made me turn against this later period more than anything.
And I think if superego had been in there, it would have contextualized all this a bit more.
Yeah, so, I think that's right. That's right. In the book, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, because I think so, like, the concept of the symptom was Lacan's way of saying capital has won. I think that's what we don't like.
Right. because I'm not willing to concede that point.
Yeah, I don't think capital.
Yeah.
And I think about capital in terms of Landian super intelligence, and I'm still not ready to concede. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
the only last thing I would just say is that if I have an actual tiny little critique,
Good.
I would say,
That's what we want. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
is when you're talking about pure excess in that book, I do see parallels between how Lacan describes the capitalist discourse and the way you talk about pure excess. So maybe on that one, there's a little bit more affinity, and there's something to at least that discourse that does get at something important about our times that is harmonious with your position.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that, right. So just to remind everyone that the capitalist discourse, it's the first one that Lacan doesn't formulate it in Seminar 17. He formulates it in a discourse in a speech in Milan, and it puts the S1. It doesn't go S1, S2, a barred subject. Instead, it goes what does it go? S1, sorry. It goes divided subject S2. The product is the objet, and then the truth is the master signifier. Right. And so I think,
which I should say, Levi's not here, but Levi wrote a really great blog post years ago on the capitalist discourse. And I'll just quote this real quick and then I'll be done. Because I think what he says here really kind of lines up with how we think about things. He says the discourse of the capitalists says something like the maternal superego, S1, commands the subject, barred subject, to enjoy in the form of commodities, S2. I won't here go into detail as to why I associate the superego of capitalism with maternal superego, beyond saying that where the superego in the universe of mastery functions as a prohibition, in the universe of capitalism, the superego now seems to command enjoyment. You must find ever more exotic and different forms of enjoyment. That's the injunction.
Yeah.
However, we'll note that in the position of the product of this discourse, we now see objet or the remainder. In the Milan discourse, Lacan claims that the discourse of the capitalist is the most ingenious discourse to date, in that it creates something like an eternal motion machine, pure excess. For each commodity, S2, the divided subject, barred subject, consumes, he experiences the disappointment. This is not it. He is thus compelled to pursue yet another commodity to fulfill the superegoic imperative. And so it goes continuously. Nothing is ever enough because no commodity is ever it. Moreover, insofar as we are obeying the superegoic imperative to enjoy, and insofar as the more we obey this superego, the more guilt we feel, this consumption is accompanied by profound guilt and anxiety. Levi Bryant, The Discourse of the Capitalist and the New Symptom. Just
pretty
great. Lot of,
really good. It's pretty great. So, I think that's, I don't have a quarrel with that. And I think, I think I guess my only point would be, and this comes back to what we were just talking about, right? That for Lacan, he kind of thinks capitalism, it's got it figured. We sort of have lost to capital. And I think the notion that it's a perpetual motion machine is, I think it's a failure on his part to think, and this is, I talk about this in Pure Excess too, the role of debt and the role that debt plays, and the way that there always is eventually there's a moment of reckoning that I think that perpetual motion machine runs up against.
Cool. All right. Yeah. Daniel, thanks for
Mikey. Thank you very much, my friend. Thank you very much. I'm very now excited to welcome our friend and comrade of the show, the Big Sig, Andrew Flores, who is relocated to San Diego, coming at us out west. We're all probably very jealous of the weather that you're experiencing out there, Andrew. And I'm excited to have you intervene. Mikey, you can stay as long as you wish, of course. Just a couple quick things. You mentioned Levi, Bryant. He's not able to make it. He unfortunately is not feeling well. I really wish he could have came. What we were talking about, his reflections on Todd's book was very rich, So maybe he'll write an article or a blog or a review. Before Andrew goes on, I just want to say one thing on this point about superego and quilting point. I think it's very interesting. It kind of connects to Paris's point about what you might call like Todd's methodology, right? Which is, even though quilting point is really one of those things like Das Ding, it's mentioned maybe seldomly, right? In Seminar on Psychosis, for example. There's a methodology that Todd, I think, is advocating, and probably, I think, if we're honest, Richard Boothby is a figure that really is a very interesting predecessor in this regard of a philosophical use of a Lacanian, let's say, of the Lacanian field of concepts, whereby we can sort of maybe pick and choose them for our philosophical ends and purposes. Okay, so if that's our method, you can see why some people might raise, and that's fine, they can raise disputes about that. But let's talk about quilting point. I see this as the central concept that ties together Zizek's theory of ideology in a certain way in The Sublime Object. But Lacan abandons the theory of the quilting point, largely having to do with these reasons that you guys are talking about. I think he abandons it because of the superego and the way that capitalism is no longer making the rapport between signifier and enjoyment possible. And so what you get is this kind of idea that communities or sort of political collectives actually cannot share a rapport over the enjoyment, that becomes a riddle to their collective possibilities. And I think in other work that Todd has written, you've written a lot about this idea of how we solve that riddle, what you might call the community, or what you might call the problem of solidarity in late capitalism, knowing full well that quilting points also introduce problems like identity politics, right? Or vulgar point, or the master signifier problem, authority, right? So I wanted to ask you, Todd, is there a way to think quilting point for collective solidarity of political communities that doesn't reinforce, and this is somewhat another way of asking what Mikey asked, and Andrew, will get to you in a moment. I know this is a complex question, but you see my point. Like, yeah, it's a major question for me. Feminist Lacanians kind of provide an answer in their criticism of the phallus, right? You at the same time say, well, Lacan doesn't allow us to think identification through binary signifier. Right. And nor do you want to suggest that communities should sort of be beautiful souls where they just identify with their lack. Right. That doesn't seem realistic, right? So this is the beauty and the subtlety of what Lacan gives to politics, in my opinion, because he's putting us to work. And these concepts, he might not agree with what we're doing with them, but we're going to do it anyways. What would you say, Todd? And then Andrew, will go to you.
Yeah, I think so. To your point about Rick, I mean, yeah, Rick has been he's one of my closest friends and decisive influence on me for sure. It's to the point. I mean, he inflates Das Ding much more than I do, but nonetheless, just hugely important to me. But I think here's what I would say. I think so. You're right. I think most of the time.
Hey, hold on. Sorry. Todd, there's getting some weird feedback. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but it's coming through, I think, on your mic, on your ear. Oh. So just.
Sorry. Does everybody else hear that, or?
I didn't hear it, but thanks for catching that, Mike.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I would just say that I think generally and usually the quilting point functions, like you're saying, Daniel, like it supports. I do make this distinction that Lacan doesn't make between master signifier and quilting point, and that's just I think I even confess that. This is just my thing. And you're right that it largely, I mean, it really, Das Ding reappears more than the quilting point does. The quilting point has a very short lifespan. It gets mentioned maybe one more time in maybe Seminar 12 or something, but in passing only and not developed but here's what I would say. Is there, it seems to me like there is a way to add a quilting point that is not there to buttress the master signifier in the way that I think I use this example in the book, the way that Jew is used to buttress Aryan as a master signifier, right? But instead is there to reveal the castration of the master signifier. And I think that's sometimes what a good interpretation, it comes back to what Mikey and I were talking about before about interpretation. I think that's what sometimes a good interpretation, and I think almost that's what the theoretical task is to introduce the proper quilting point and then change the terrain based on, or allow people to form some kind of collective based on the introduction of that quilting point. So I think that's not only, yeah, Daniel, I think not only is that important, I think that's the chief function of the theorists today, is to not to create a new master signifier. I think that is absolutely not it, but instead to intervene with the quilting point that's not going to just affirm a master signifier, but instead is going to allow us to relate to it. It's kind of like what I was saying to Stephanie, allow us to relate to the master signifier in its castration, right? We still have it, but we see it, we're bound to it through its castration. And I think that's really crucial.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, I think for folks listening, I think this is the heart of what we have called, Tupanamba and I have called, the Lacanian left. I mean, we just had Kopjek on the show, and when Laclau was at Buffalo, he was working on this precise problem, and he argued that the theory of the partial object could function as the site of identification in his wider hegemony theory. And, Kopjek was helping him develop the right, precise application of the Lacanian field of concepts to arrive at that. So that's, I think, the very interesting thing about Lacan and Marxism, right? Which is you have this repertoire of these highly contested concepts. You have the clinical problem, you have the philosophical dynamic, you have the fact that they evolve, that Lacan's changing his mind so dramatically. But then you have this methodology that Todd is sort of offering, which is what I like, where actually philosophers can have a degree of, within reason, can use these concepts for political social application. Would you agree with that? And I guess it does raise that question, right? Which is, one does need to anchor their use of the Lacanian conceptual field, I think, in a constant immersion into Lacan's work. Sure. Like you need to work on Lacan all the time. And even for myself, I've been working on this for almost 20 years. And I realize if I I'll put it this way, to read Lacan requires weekly repetition. Would you agree with that? Like,
I wouldn't go that far, Daniel, just because I have other things to do in my life. Like, because for one thing, if you want to really be versed in Hegel too, that you're gonna have to spend a lot of weeks working on Hegel, right? So I don't think it can be weekly, and I do think that is it's just part of it is. But I take your point. I don't want to object to the point. Like, I think
you see my point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there are Lacanians who, like Badiou says, right? It's actually important to reach a point of completion with Lacan.
Yeah.
For him, what that means is a certain freedom to say, I know what is important to me in the field of the concepts. I don't need to go back and reread. Right. I'm confessing that I actually feel like I do, because I'm still trying to figure stuff out.
I do all the time. I mean, I do all the time. I mean, I teach Lacan all the time, so I'm constantly rereading. And I think that's really important. The weekly thing kind of tripped me up, because that would be a lot.
That was a little intense. Yeah. We're just doing weekly now. So
yeah, but no, I mean, I think that's incredibly important. I think you're right, because as you said, my way is to Lacan from philosophy. And so what I am drawn to is not clearly what Paris is drawn to. Like, I just am not gonna be the kind of person that gets into a textual shouting match with someone. I just don't care about that. I just care about, does the thinker offer me a certain kind of concept that can be deployed in a way that's going to be helpful to me. So if that means I'm going to get the thinker a little wrong, and because the concept, like quilting point, like I admit I'm kind of torturing it. Right.
You're not using quilting point to talk about the psychotic structure.
Not at all.
Not
at all. Right. Not at all. Which is the only time Lacan talks about it. Right. Except it does. People forget this. It figures in the graph of desire at this one point. Right?
In the subversion
essay. Correct. Right. Because other times it's just there and he doesn't even mention it when he's talking about the graph of desire. But in the subversion essay, he does mention it. So I think, I think you just, like, there are different approaches, right? Like some people are going to torture the concept. I'm going to torture the concepts, and other people are not. And so maybe, I mean, if Paris thinks I'm not the person to write the introduction, maybe he's right. I mean, and to be honest, like, I had to write this introduction in a way that was enjoyable for me to write, because I don't have a inherent interest in, I don't have an interest in writing an introduction to anybody. Like, that does not interesting to me. And the only reason I did it was because my friend, who I could never say no to, demanded that I do it. And so I did it. And then so to make it, to torture the concepts in a way and to make it polemical was the only way I could make it doable. So yeah, I mean, maybe I'm the wrong person, and he should read Sean Homer's introduction, or I mean, Caleb Neal wrote a great introduction, I think. So, and I think I have a blurb on Caleb Neal's introduction that says, "No one ever need write another introduction to Lacan after this," which is true, I think. So that's so I don't. So yeah, I take your point about that totally.
Beautiful. Andrew, sorry to keep you waiting, comrade. Please take it away.
Yeah, no worries. This is a great conversation. Glad that Mikey is still in the chat. I haven't talked to Mikey online since the $1 billion Nance episode on AI.
And I think that was the last time.
Yeah, I don't think I've actually talked to Todd since we did the Seminar 2 interview with you, right?
Right.
I mean, we did see each other in passing at the Zizek.
At LAC, right?
Yeah.
LAC,
no, I didn't make it to LAC. It was the one that Russ hosted in Jersey back in 2020.
Oh, right.
Yeah, with Michael and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, before you get in, like, I like the way Mikey was just like, let's just do the back and forth. I don't really care for the let me talk for 15 minutes and then you have your time to speak. But before I give my my words, like, I just want to add to the conversation regarding superego, because I think if there is something important to political theory, Marxism, and social theory that psychoanalysis brings, I think it is the superego. But I think one of the things in hearing your guys' discussion that should be mentioned, and even though this is kind of more of the Freud aspect, I still think it's retained in Seminar 2 of Lacan. And I think that Seminar 2 is the seminar on the death drive. I think that's the death drive. I will die on that horse. Like, that's the death drive seminar. And he brings in a really good notion of the superego. But Leon Rosichner, in his work called Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism, gives in an account of the superego, in which he kind of specifies how we can't forget how the superego is not only the site of censorship, but of an original trauma that repeats the ambivalence between the love for the mother and the hatred towards the father. And he sees this sort of come out in this Christian injunction of universal love. And so I think maybe, like, seen in the way in which the superego today, if it is the injunction to enjoy, what is that telling us about some traumatic origin, right? About our political climate, or, about, whether it's like the superegoic injunction of MAGA or something like that. Mm-hmm. What's the site of trauma that's repeating, and that the superego is also siphoning off of the drive. But yeah, like, it's really great to be here, Todd and Mikey, and thank you, Daniel, for organizing this. I would say, like, just as a positive remark, like, wow, I wasn't even expecting you to write an intro on Lacan. Like, I was waiting for the Hegel before the Lacan one, and then you, like, came out with the Lacan one, at a far field. And so, like, I will say, like, regardless of, where we may read Lacan differently, or our theoretical approaches, like hats off to you, because like it's one thing to read Lacan, it's one thing to talk about Lacan, but it's another thing to write on Lacan, and it is very difficult, right? And so the fact that you're able to pull it off, because you pretty much list almost every single concept, with the exception of maybe the superego and the letter, but you cover everything from the registers, the big other, the little other, the phallus, which is a huge concept, and I know that you draw a lot from the concept of the phallus a lot. The gaze, I mean, the list goes on, and the attempt to periodize it. It's really accessible, and one of the things that I've noticed, whether it's from university students in America or those that are somewhat barred from the university that are into theory, are like, oh my God, Lacan is so difficult. Like, I'm afraid to read him. But I think with this text, what you do is kind of give an access point for people who are new or interested in psychoanalysis to be able to read this and not feel like it's beyond them. It's just like, you know, I was in my martial arts class today, and they were talking about, the instructor was talking about how, like, to practice at home, don't just be a class-oriented person, train at home. Don't just learn at school, read at home. And so there's like this insistence, well, like, well, what if I get it wrong by doing it at home? Well, it's like, of course, you don't fucking know the shit. That's what my instructor literally said. You don't know this. The point is to practice at home and get it wrong. And so I think the point is to read Lacan and get it wrong, because you're never going to understand the first instance. It's always about like getting better. But the point is, like, you give that focal point to really bring an accessible approach to Lacan, regardless if you may misinterpret him a bit or you have your own stylistic approach to Lacanian theory. And so with that being said, I do have some, constructive criticisms that I like to approach, because you do make the point that Lacan is a philosopher of some type, and he has a philosophical system and something regarding a political project or something that could inform politics. Now, I know a lot of us here identify with philosophy or associated with philosophy to some extent, but I would like to humor the anti-philosophical approach, as I am more influenced by Milner than Badiou, and I would actually consider myself more Milnerian than Lacan at times, because I've been really influenced by Milner's work on The Search of Clarity. And there's a point where he says that Lacan has an anti-philosophical aspect to the system insofar as what he discovers with not only the signifier, but of jouissance is indifferent to philosophy insofar as that it's aligning its concepts or its system with conscious thinking. And in the book, you mentioned a lot about Lacan's philosophy or Lacan's relationship to Kant and Hegel. But one of the things I think is missing, and I don't know if it's just because it's the fact it's an introduction, but Lacan's relationship to science, which I think is huge and we cannot ignore. And I think that is played out not only in the seminars or as, Milner says in the written Lacan, but it's just pivotal because of Freud, who has a relationship to science and the Copernican shift. And so maybe you could say something about that before I continue with my other remarks. Like, what are your thoughts on Lacan's relationship to science? And not that Lacan is a scientist, but he has a relationship to what he will call the discourse of science.
Right. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I love Jean-Claude. He's a cool guy. I hope he's still alive. Is he still alive?
Yeah. I think he's
like good. Because I tried to do a little online interview with him, and he just wouldn't do it. So
we need to translate his book on Harry Potter, by the way.
Or Le Triple Plaisir, I think, is a really
that would probably be better.
Yeah. That's a great.
He has one called The Love of Linguistics too. That's not translated.
Yeah. He's a great guy.
He's brilliant. He's literally very brilliant.
He's incredible. I mean, I know for political reasons, people have kind of turned away from him a little bit, but I think he's really cool. And I was editing that series that translated that got that book translated. So
did you make an argument, Todd, that it should be translated to The Clear Work as opposed to In Search? I asked Ed, I'm like, why did you guys choose that title? The other title would have sold more books. It's a more dramatic title.
Oh,
if
well,
you say Lacan has a clear work. That's the actual translation.
No, I know. So here's what happened. So Milner wanted, this is a really interesting story. I'm glad to tell this. And you're going to be pissed at me because I'm the one responsible for In Search of Clarity, but it was a compromise. So Milner wanted the clear work, right? He just thought, let's make it the clear work. And the editors at Northwestern would not publish it with that name. And so they wanted to call it l'oeuvre, the clear oeuvre. And Milner was absolutely adamant, you cannot publish it. That is a French word. That is not an English word. You cannot publish it with that. And so they asked Adrian and Slavoj and me if we had any other ideas. And then I came up with this In Search of Clarity, and Jean-Claude was like, okay. And the editor was like, okay. So that's what happened. It was a kind of heated exchange. Like Milner really he did not want it to be the clear oeuvre. And the editor just would not. Northwestern was really, so Rick Boothby, his book, what's the religion book? Embracing the Void. He had, his title was Is Nothing Sacred? And they just would not let him. They just said, you cannot publish it with that title. So, and he just went, and all three of the editors, Adrian, Slavoj, and I were totally on his side. They just didn't care. And then they fired us from the series very soon after that. So that was the end. Okay. Sorry for that detour. Yeah. Lacan and science. So it's one thing that just fell because of just where my interests lie and what I don't, and just like mathematics, which is what we were talking about earlier, that just has no place in this book. And that is a really, really, I understand. That's a very tendentious take on Lacan. And sorry. That said, I think that to me, one of the most interesting and revelatory statements about, obviously there's the Science and Truth écrit, but I think that one of the most revelatory statements comes in Seminar 11, where he says, I think Milner has asked him a question. Jacques-Alain Milner has asked him a question. I'm not exactly sure, pretty sure. And he says, the subject I'm dealing with is the subject of modern science, right? And that to me, and then I think, here's where I think it really, and I think this is a political vision, part of his political vision too, which is why it's interesting. And maybe I should have even talked about it. And it's just good that you brought it up. That what science cannot think is subjectivity, right? Like that is a absolute blank spot within science, and necessarily so, because if a scientific experiment depends upon the subject carrying it out, it's not a scientific experiment, right? That's our criteria, that it can be reproduced by someone else, and that the subject does not matter. And so that absence of the subject, I think, for Lacan is what then creates this space for the subject that he's talking about. So I think that he would say that subjective, and it is interesting, and this brings back to what Daniel was saying about Kant, because Kant is the first philosopher, and I whenever I think about this, it kind of shocks me that he's the first one to really use the term subject in the way that we use it, right? So Descartes, we think, oh, it's Descartes. Oh, no, it's not. He doesn't. He talks about the I, right, or the cogito. But it's only Kant, and then I think it's modern science really that introduces that subjectivity emerges as a problem precisely because it's a gap within modern scientific discourse. So that's what that's where I think is the really crucial, where Lacan's crucial, that he doesn't think, and I think you're right to say, for Freud, psychoanalysis was a science, or is on the way to being a science. And Lacan clearly does not say that. But at the same time, he doesn't say psychoanalysis is an art, right? He's not on that thing. So I think he thinks it's in a way the underside, what's missing within modern science, I think. It's what's
7-minute warning, y'all. Okay. Just as a heads up, just because I don't want to keep Todd he's been fielding questions for almost an hour and a half. Andrew, go.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. And like the subject is like even though it's like the hypokimenon, it's really like, Kant and then Lacan, who really uses the term subjectivity as what we would understand now.
Right.
Now,
Well, Hegel does for sure too.
Oh yeah, Hegel.
Yeah.
Getting into the other aspects of the book regarding the three registers, one of the ones I wanted to focus on was the symbolic, because you make this point, and here's the criticism is the symbolic order is language. And I think this is something that Paris might have touched on a little bit, but I kind of wanted to focus on this because in Seminar 2, he defines the symbolic order as a machine, right? But here you use language. And Lacan, and the textual reason, Lacan will always distinguish between speech, language, and discourse, right? These have three separate things. Right. Now, do you stand by the fact that the symbolic order is language, or would you kind of correct that and maybe say that there's a symbolic aspect to language?
Right. I mean, language is part of the symbolic order, right? Right. I mean, I'm not in no way. In fact, I can't remember the book well enough to say, but I think that when I'm talking about the symbolic order, I use the example of Mount Everest as a way to so that's clearly functioning as a symbolic thing. It's not the name Mount Everest necessarily, right? It's not the word Mount Everest. It has a symbolic function. So yeah, I'm not a reduction of the symbolic to language. And if that came through in the book, I don't know what to say about that. That's just an error of my writing or something that or a way that got interpreted. But I do not in any way believe the symbolic is reducible to language, or that we should think about. I think that oftentimes when you're teaching, and this is probably why this happened in the book, oftentimes when I'm teaching, I will use language as a way to talk about what the symbolic is to students. And so that's probably why I maybe had recourse to that more than was appropriate.
Yeah. And then I'll make three more points because I know we're short in our time. So the other aspect to that, because the Mount Everest one is when you start to talk about signifier, and you mentioned the word signifier over and over again. But in my opinion, reading it, signifier is never really defined. What you do is you contrast the sign and saussure to Lacan preferring the signifier over the signifier-signified relationship. Yeah. But the only thing you differentiate between the two is the fact that the signifier is useful because of the Freudian slip, which is an example, but the signifier as such is never really defined for Lacan, which the definition is, that it cannot refer to itself for meaning, that it refers on another one.
Well, also that the signifier represents the subject for another signifier, right? I mean, that's he repeats that. If we talk about things that stay the same in Lacan, that's a thing that stays the same for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. So and it can't represent itself. Yeah, I that you're right. That's just a lacuna. I don't have an issue. I mean, whatever. There are things that I wish that I included that I didn't include. So yeah.
And I would say the discourse one. I know you're not really a fan of the discourse theory, but one of the things you say is that we have a sort of multiplicity of symbolic orders. Because
I don't think I say that, because I think maybe I do, but that is not correct. I mean, obviously, Lacan thinks that the discourses are different ways of relating to the symbolic, right? They're not. It's not like each discourse is its own separate symbolic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Because I mean, maybe I read it wrong, but it's I know you said it's different ways of relating to the symbolic, but I guess I would like to get your thoughts more on the discourse, because Daniel and I in the group, we actually we read 16 and 17 back to back, and he says, and this goes off to what you were just saying about the signifier, that the signifier is what represents the subject for another signifier, and he maps that out into the master's discourse. The master's discourse is that as such, the signifier, which tries to represent the subject, to the battery bank. And so it's interesting that you put the four discourses are different ways in which we can relate, I guess, symbolically, if I understand what you're saying correctly, because he says in, I think, page 13 or 14 of 17, that it's because I have this four-legged animal of the signifier, which represents the subject for another signifier, that this causes a quarter turn to create three other discourses, right? Mm-hmm. So my question is it the fact that we have four different ways of relating symbolically, or we have a combination based upon, a permutation of a formula that doesn't work, right? I don't know if that makes sense.
What do you mean doesn't work? What
the master's discourse, which is like a formula that doesn't work, right? Because it's an impossibility or an impotence, as he says.
But there's an impossibility in every discourse for Lacan, right? Like that's his whole point, that there's an impossibility of the relation. Like each discourse, I always took it that each discourse emerges out of the there's a real link, because in 16 he's the first time he says there is no sexual relation, right? And so you get this impossible or non-relation that then structures the discourses, and then I think that's what's driving the quarter turns of each discourse. Which you're right, I don't talk about that in the book.
Right. And it does make sense, because when you look at the vectors, like the only ones that don't meet are truth and the product, right? That's the placement of impossibility, or
that's where impossibility is. Yeah.
And impotence. So it's like, and I think going back to philosophy, because with the master's discourse, even though he'll talk about the master's like dialectic, he'll even say that, this is the formula for the unconscious. The formula for fantasy is plugged in there when you look at the bottom, barred S and then little a next to it at the product. But then he'll say like the core doctrine of science, or science's fantasy, is in the master's discourse. And then he'll also say that the history of philosophy itself, or philosophy insofar it's stuck with knowledge, is in the master's discourse.
Yeah, but he contradicts himself, because there are times when he says Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit's the great example of the master's discourse, and then he'll say phenomenology of spirit's the great example of university discourse. He just says both things.
And also Hegel's also the greatest hysteric.
Right.
And so I guess
that was Slavoj's dissertation.
That's right. That's the first book in French.
And so I guess what I'm trying to like build up to is like thinking about the theory of discourse, if you accept them or at all, at least the master's one, and maybe the university, like what is your conception of philosophy without a sort of stranglehold by this attempt of mastery? Meaning, like, for example, the barred subject is always excluded, right, from its own discourse, and yet is the cause of discourse. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's the exclude, and he talks about this in Science and Truth, because the split subject is split between knowledge and truth. So I guess with your framework in philosophy, do you aim at more of truth than immersed in knowledge?
For sure. Yeah. For sure. And I think it comes back to what Daniel was saying about what the role of, I mean, to me, I think he really does it, again, just to refer back to Seminar 11, he does this great thing where he quotes Picasso, remember, Je ne cherche pas, je trouve. And he says, he talks about the difference between hermeneutics and interpretation. And I think hermeneutics for him is about the accumulation of knowledge, and interpretation is about finding a certain truth. And so yeah, I think that's, to me, that's a point that's incredibly valuable about him. Back to the political question. I mean, I think that's a really important political question. And I think a lot of, I think this is what he had against social science, right? That it was hermeneutical. It's whether it thinks it is, or, I mean, it's not probably indebted to hermeneutical tradition consciously, but it is hermeneutical. And that's why he thought social science didn't even deserve the moniker. And I think that's really, that distinction between truth and knowledge, and between hermeneutics and interpretation is politically the key thing.
Right. And it's also like a stab at Marxism, because he says in Science and Truth that there is no science of man or science of the human. There's only like sciences that deal with the subject, right?
Right, but Marxism is a social science for him.
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
I think it's not. I think it's that's the problem with it, that it is a social science.
Yeah, and this emphasis of consciousness, which he says that,
right, of course,
consciousness is to be duped, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's all I have to say for now.
Thanks.
Wonderful, Andrew.
Yeah.
Todd, thank you so much for this. Initially, I was like, hey, Todd, will you come on and I'll just give you an interview? And then I thought, well, there's all of these people, like there's Mikey, there's Andrew, there's Levi Bryant has joined our Discord and has been talking about the book. So it's like I got to involve all of these cats and all of these comrades. So thank you for this symposium. Thank you all, Stephanie, Mikey, Andrew, Paris, everyone that presented. Thank you for the chat. But maybe, Todd, we can have you back on to talk about your other works on the main podcast. I would love to talk about Emancipation After Hegel.
Sure.
I find your reading of Hegel to be extremely original and interesting. I always learn so much reading your work. I think there's an article that I wrote once about your book on capitalism, and I forget the exact title. You written multiple of them. And for whatever reason, this is like one of the most widely read pieces I've ever written. It's just a review. I was like, come on, guys.
Oh, that's unfair.
But, and thank you also for one thing we didn't mention is that I think this book is really good because it identifies a lot of Lacanian scholars in the United States, but also beyond, that are working today that maybe are not as as well known. And so I think your work has always been good because you're giving that community a space through the LAC conference primarily, which everybody should check out the LAC conference and check out Todd's page. So we just want to thank you for your work. And
do I have a page, Daniel? I don't think I have a
YouTube page. YouTube.
Oh,
channel.
YouTube. Okay. Right.
I should have said channel. My bad. Yeah,
it's okay.
And now, somebody was asking how the podcast is going.
What one? Why Theory?
Why Theory? Yeah.
I think it's fine. I mean, I don't know. Ask Mikey. Is it shitty now or not? I don't know.
I mean, it's Why Theory.
It's the same. It's been the same for what, 8 years, I think. Yeah, it's the same.
Well, people were praising the Why Theory podcast.
That's nice
chat,
of them.
So
Okay.
there you go.
Okay.
But thanks for your work, Todd. Thank you
You're
all
welcome.
for everything, and we'll do it again soon.
All right. Thanks. See
all
you,
the
everybody.
best, everybody.
Bye.